Religious Crusades. In March 1096, farmers in northern France paused in their plowing to listen to a distant roar. It was the sound of a vast crowd of people singing hymns and calling others to join them. The farmers watched the approaching mob of peasants, some 20,000 strong, led by a man dressed as a hermit. The farmers immediately knew who he was. For months, Peter the Hermit had been calling on all Christians to join his fight to free Jerusalem. His preaching had inspired thousands to follow him. Like so many others before them, the farmers left their fields and became part of Peter the Hermit's army. The Crusades, a series of military campaigns to establish Christian control over the Holy Land, had begun. Over the next few centuries, wave after wave of peasants, soldiers, and kings would travel from Europe to the Middle East in pursuit of this goal. Their campaigns would reshape both Europe and the Middle East. Call for a crusade. The Crusades began with high hopes. One goal was to protect Christian pilgrims as they visited the Holy Land of Palestine. Muslim caliphs or leaders had generally allowed Christian pilgrims to visit holy places. But in the early 1000s, the Fatimid Arabs started destroying churches and killing pilgrims. Then in 1071, Seljuk Turks took over Jerusalem from the Fatimids. The Turks harassed pilgrims and marched on the Christian city of Constantinople. So the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople asked Pope Urban II for help. The Pope's Call. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a crusade to free the Holy Land. He called on the soldiers of Christ to defend Constantinople and liberate Jerusalem from the Turks. People answered the Pope's call with enthusiasm. Their slogan was Dieu le veut, which means God wills it. The Crusaders' Creed. Some religious leaders use feudal concepts to explain the idea of a holy war. Since Jesus was every Christian's Lord, Jesus' vassals were obliged to defend his lands and shrines. So a crusade was a just or righteous war. The word crusade comes from the Latin word crux, or cross. Crusaders sewed a cross on their clothing. They took a vow to make a pilgrimage to Jesus' tomb. Like other pilgrims, crusaders were promised forgiveness for sins. People who took the cross made many sacrifices. Crusaders faced robbers, hunger, and disease before even encountering the enemy. Knights sold estates and borrowed money to pay for the long and dangerous trip. On his way to the Holy Land, one crusader, the French noble Jean de Joinville, wrote, "I never once let my eyes turn back towards Joinville, for fear my heart might be filled with longing at the thought of my lovely castle and the 2 children I had left behind." Jean de Joinville, Life of St. Louis. Although many crusaders were members of the nobility, others hoped to gain land and wealth by joining the Crusades. The First Crusade. Perhaps as many as 150,000 people hurried to join. The first group of crusaders to leave for the Holy Land was a ragged mob of peasants led by Peter the Hermit. Peter's army of untrained men, women, and children was not prepared for the long journey to the Middle East. Most were killed by the Turks before ever reaching the Holy Land. More professional armies followed, traveling by land and sea. Despite setbacks, the First Crusade was a military success. The Crusaders had one important advantage. They took the Muslim kingdoms by surprise. The Muslims of the Middle East were too divided to resist. By 1099, the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem and established 4 Crusader states in the Holy Land. The Crusaders also turned back the Turks' advance on Constantinople. Reading check. Why did people join the Crusades? Second and Third Crusades. The Crusader states were always on the defensive. In 1144, the Muslims counterattacked and conquered the northern Crusader state of Edessa. The fall of Edessa alarmed Europeans so much that the Pope called for a Second Crusade. Second Crusade. King Louis VII of France and the German Emperor organized the Second Crusade. Other monarchs, such as King Louis's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, also joined this crusade. But despite its powerful backing, the Second Crusade failed. There were several reasons for this failure. For example, the Crusade's leaders argued. The Crusaders, who often treated the Muslim majority of Palestine with disrespect and even cruelty, were unable to gain local support. After the Second Crusade failed, the Muslim leader Saladin grew stronger. In 1187, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem. Crusade of the Kings. The fall of Jerusalem provoked the Third Crusade, which began in 1189. Because it was organized by the rulers of England, France, and Germany, it was called the Crusade of the Kings. Richard I of England, called the Lionheart, became leader of this crusade. He won important victories and developed a courteous relationship with Saladin. Saladin's noble character inspired respect even from his enemies. One of Saladin's officials told how a terrified prisoner was brought before Saladin. The interpreter asked him, the prisoner, "What are you afraid of?" God inspired him to reply, "At first, I was afraid of seeing that face, but after seeing it and standing in his presence, I am sure that I shall see only good in it." The Sultan was moved, pardoned him, and let him go free. Baha'u'ddin ibn Shaddad. Saladin and Richard signed a truce that ended the Third Crusade. Christian pilgrims were free to travel, and Saladin agreed to respect Crusader lands. But Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Reading check. What did the Third Crusade fail to achieve? Fourth and later Crusades. The Fourth Crusade embarrassed the Pope who had launched it. The Crusaders never reached the Holy Land. Instead, they tried to fund their campaign by looting Christian cities along the route. Looting Constantinople. In 1204, Crusaders stormed Constantinople, the rich Byzantine capital. For 3 days, they smashed Christian icons, stole relics, and attacked women. The Pope was furious. He wrote that Crusaders, who should have used their swords against the infidel, unbeliever, have bathed those swords in the blood of Christians. The Byzantines never forgave the Catholic Christians. Later Crusades. In 1212, a popular crusading movement swept through France and Germany. The so-called Children's Crusade attracted poor people of all ages. Most never got farther than Italy. Although several more crusades were launched, the Crusaders were slowly forced out of the Holy Land. Finally, in 1291, Egyptian Muslims defeated the last Crusader state. The Muslim view. Muslims in the Middle East were caught off guard by the first waves of Crusaders. The Muslim world was too divided politically to organize a strong defense. Most Muslims regarded the Crusaders as soldiers hired to win back Byzantine lands. However, Muslim counterattacks became more successful. Like the Crusaders, Muslims described their own campaigns in religious terms as holy war. Reading check. What important event happened during the Fourth Crusade? Religious persecutions. In Europe, the Crusades fueled dangerous passions. Religious fervor against Muslims led to brutal attacks against all whose beliefs differed from church teachings. Soon after the First Crusade began, campaigns were launched against religious minorities in Europe itself. Attacks on Jewish communities. Jewish groups were the first targets of attacks in Europe. Some Europeans already considered Jews to be enemies of Christianity and used the Crusades as an excuse for violence. Mobs of Christian peasants turned on those Jews who would not instantly convert to Christianity. During the First Crusade, these mobs terrorized and slaughtered the Jewish communities along Crusader routes to the Middle East. The worst violence occurred in German cities along the Rhine River, such as Mainz and Cologne. Thousands of Jews killed themselves and their families to escape torture and murder. When the Knights of the First Crusade took Jerusalem in 1099, they slaughtered Jews and Muslims alike. A few Christian clergymen tried to protect the Jews, but the public mood led to more persecution in Crusader countries. Jews were expelled from England in 1290 and from France in 1306. Crusades against heretics. Jews were not the only victims of religious persecution in Europe. Other targets included groups of Christians who followed various heresies. A heresy is a belief that is rejected by official church teaching. Medieval Christians would not tolerate even minor differences in beliefs. Heretics were seen as lost sheep doomed for eternity. Many were considered dangerous because their heretical ideas might influence others. At first, heretics were excommunicated. This was a serious punishment because the church was the center of medieval life. However, some heretics clung to their beliefs. The Pope called on nobles to organize local crusades against them. In the Languedoc region of southern France, entire communities of Christians were massacred or exiled for disagreeing with church teachings. Accusations of heresy were used to destroy the Knights Templars, who had once been the military heroes of the Crusades. The Templars were an order of military monks approved by the Church in 1127. As warriors, they were greatly admired during the Crusades. However, they also set up an international banking system, which made them rich and envied. The King of France, who owed them money, had their leaders arrested in 1307. The Templar leaders were accused of heresy, tortured, and burned alive. The Inquisition. In the 1200s, Pope Gregory IX created the Inquisition, a series of investigations designed to find and judge heretics. Accused heretics who did not cooperate were punished. Heretics were punished in various ways. Minor differences in beliefs might be forgiven with a fast or a whipping. More serious accusations could lead to fines or imprisonment. If a heretic would not confess, often under torture, he or she was turned over to the civil authorities to be executed. Reading check. What happened to Jewish communities during the Crusades? Effects of the Crusades. The Crusades failed to achieve their goal of forcing the Muslims out of the Holy Land. In addition, centuries of fighting weakened the Byzantine Empire, which had protected Europe from Turkish invasion. However, the Crusades did have some lasting effects in Europe. A wider world. The Crusades opened Europeans' eyes to the rest of the world. People who had never been farther from home than the next village suddenly saw new lands, peoples, and ways of life. The Crusades may have encouraged Europeans to explore distant parts of the world. Some historians believe that the adventurous spirit of the Crusades helped lead to the great European voyages of discovery that began in the late 1400s. Trade with the East. The Crusades brought wealth and trade to European port cities. Italian cities such as Venice and Genoa had always traded by sea. They were eager to supply the needs of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. The Crusader states were surrounded by hostile populations and had to depend on goods shipped from Europe. In the process, old trade routes between Europe and the Middle East were reopened. The merchants of Venice and Genoa also opened trading colonies in Egypt. As trade routes reopened, trade increased. Crusaders returned home with silks, spices, and other exotic goods. Demand for these products at home encouraged European merchants to expand trade with Asia and to search for faster routes to China and India.